Hello everyone. That's right, there's another sarcastic Englishman on the internet. I'm sure we really needed another one of those. But that's not the thrust of this video. I'm not entirely sure why it took me so long to get this one out, but never mind. About 3 months ago, a YouTube content creator by the name of Kraut and Tea made a video on his objections to tribalism and its role in the formation of a nation-state. I've linked to his original video in the description, and I highly recommend you watch it before this video, as I'm only featuring excerpts here, and he makes some well-constituted arguments. And they're definitely worthy of consideration and the rest, but for the sake of time I just can't address them, so I've decided to pick a few out that I decidedly thought that I could, if not debunk, because I suppose there's nothing to debunk here, there aren't any claims being made, it's more along the lines of I disagree with his position on this, and I think that I can persuade or bring round a few people to my way of viewing things. Now, I do agree with the majority of the points he makes in the video. However, as I've said, I do take some exceptions. Most notably, his assertion that by focusing on the preservation of one's culture, that you are somehow forfeiting the ability to do the same with the rights and liberties of individuals. Now, this to me isn't true, and I'll get into that later, so I'll let my German cousin here set the stage for the discussion, and we'll continue onwards.
Let me ask you a question which sounds simple, yet might take a while to answer and think through. What makes a nation? What makes a society?
That's a really good question, especially considering that your bloody Chancellor, Frau Merkel, has kept up the grand German tradition of trying to wipe out their neighbours, third time lucky. What happened to Lebensraum? You were really onto something there, weren't you? Alright, okay. I'm joking, of course, but to answer your question, I refer you to the clip I showed you at the beginning of the video. You might just wonder what it was that you were staring at. Well, that was the entrance to Canterbury Cathedral. Over 1,000 years went into its construction, and it is still central to the bountiful success of my hometown. I'm not making the argument that religion is the central point of a society. As Kraut later points out, there are at the very least some flaws to that system. No, instead I put it to you, in the case of the cathedral, being able to understand, adapt and display your heritage keeps you connected to the past, and therein to the value of the rights which we enjoy here in the West, as you understand their costs and appreciate the individual achievements of those involved in bringing the society you live in to fruition. This propagates a healthy patriotism, not attached to concepts as arbitrary as race, but instead to the developments of all collective, in this case, English. An Englishman being defined quite simply as a people native to England whose first language is English. This is the unavoidable truth of what defines an Englishman, and encompasses a wide range of ethnicities, creeds and beliefs, if anything more inclusive than any political concept. However, as I mentioned, just because it encompasses a wide range of beliefs doesn't mean that there aren't some central ones that everyone can agree on and recognise. And, as I've said, unless you can understand the history behind gaining these rights in your country, and understand how your particular way of life enabled that, then you're unable to fully appreciate the rights that you were born into, which others had to fight for beforehand. A classic example in English history is the Reform Act, which was a law in England which was pushed for decades, and only extended the franchise slightly, but eventually led to universal male suffrage, a concept which before had been completely outrageous and ostracised many people from polite society, much in the same way as we are now arguing that concepts such as race and gender don't necessarily impact someone's prospects in life anymore, at least in Western society. So I suppose that's my point, is that when we lose contact with our heritage and the unique nature of our culture, the unique methods and beliefs and ways of life that brought about our philosophies, we lose an appreciation for the system that we now prosper in. And that, I believe, is a majority of the reason why social justice is incredibly dangerous. It's because it doesn't just actively help to deteriorate those structures, but it is rooted in the idea that your culture and heritage as a white Westerner is a bad thing, that you should be ashamed of it, that no matter how many good things you have brought to the world, you have ultimately given more harm than good. Whereas actually, if you have a deeper understanding of your own history and heritage, that's not true. Now, I know that that's not necessarily a complete rebuttal of your point, but I think it's an important thing to consider when arguing that point, and hopefully that'll give you something to think about. And this kind of leads on into my second point here, that ideologies like Islam and feminism are dangerous, as they seek not to adapt and change themselves to fit the society and values which are found in the countries that they find themselves in. This is in the case of Islam and migrants from certain regions of the world. And in the case of feminism, you're brought up with the belief that the society you're living in is inherently bad. They seek, not to, as I said, adapt and change themselves to fit the society or culture they find themselves in, but to bend it to their own iron will, dismantling that which came before instead of building on it like everybody else. In this way, they're much like Marxists, in the way that they want to break up the established way of doing things and redistribute resources. Is the aim of Marxism, and in the ideas of Islam, it's God and belief. In feminism, it's apparent privileges. It's why I complain about Islam being culturally incompatible, because, as you later mentioned, culture is fluid and it leaves room for change. Whereas ideologues coming from the left or the right, or from a religion, constrain themselves to codify beliefs and void themselves of subjectivity.
Language. Is that the determining factor in what shapes a nation? This is probably the factor by which 19th century civic nationalists would have determined it. French speakers united in one French nation, and those who speak German united under one German nation under one German language.
Now, in your video, you go on to say that the collapses of both the Spanish and the British empires are apt examples of language failing to unite a people. You can have the best cement in the world, mate, but if you have shite foundations and another bloke has a stick of dynamite, that wall is coming down. Now, that's a saying, and by that I mean that language didn't fail to keep the 13 colonies of the New World inside my country's empire. Instead, these colonies were subject to issues such as lack of representation, which otherwise was being provided to their contemporaries on the mainland. It wasn't a difference in language. This doesn't mean that language failed to unite the colonies with the mainland. It only serves to show the difficult but important distinction between the colony and the colonizer. Just because you have a system and that system fails doesn't mean the system itself was bad. There can be a multitude of underlying reasons as to why that system does not work. American judiciary Joseph Bradley points out a violation of one of the fundamental principles of that constitution in the colonies, namely the principle that recognises the property of the people as their own, and which therefore regards all taxes for the support of government as gifts of the people through their representatives, and regards taxation without representation as subversives of free government, was the origin of our own revolution. This is in reference to the American Revolution. So it seems, even in this regard, they did consider themselves Englishmen. This wasn't, a breakdown of the bindings of language and shared culture. This was an issue of legal rights and representation. The empire was not meant to unify as a singular nation either, so in this I think it's a little bit of a false equivalence. But instead it served to further the interests of the mainland. That is the purpose of all imperial ventures, and is ultimately the underlying reason for all imperial failure. This does not render language useless as a method for unity. After all, there is a reason that Islamists insist on reading and writing the Quran in Arabic. It's to create a homogeneous approach to the text. It's in the same way that if the Catholic Church insisted on writing the Bible in Latin, it wasn't simply because it was hard for people to learn Latin, although that was a major part of it. It was because it distinguished those who could read the Bible and who were in the religious know, as it were, and those who weren't. It created an in-group and an out-group, a clear distinction, which was incredibly important to maintaining not only their distance and therefore the allure of the church, but in the case of Islam, it creates a here's us, here's the good people, here's Dar Islam, and here's the kafar, the unbeliever, the infidel.
The idea of uniting a nation around confession died with the kings who professed to have God's authority to enforce God's divine law. Confession as a unifying factor within a society is an authoritarian model, and as such a society united around faith is no substitute for liberty.
I know a certain family who might take issue with that statement, mate. Just because you continentals got a bit mental and decided to get rid of your heads of state, literally in some cases, doesn't mean the entire concept is flawed. The Royal House of Windsor, formerly of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, derives its authority to rule over the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, not from the state or a constitution, but directly from the Judeo-Christian God of the Anglican Church, formed in 1558 by Henry VIII. This is evident in Her Majesty's Queen Elizabeth II's style of Queen Elizabeth II, by grace of God, Queen of this realm, and of her other realms and territories, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith. Last I looked, we didn't live in a dictatorship, yet my monarch, who provides legitimacy to the state government through her royal office, rides at the fore of the largest Christian denomination in my country. Heading the state religion, which has been the case for the last 458 years, with our freedom serving only to increase until recent developments like the Investigatory Powers Act, but that was an action of the state, not necessarily the monarchy. But that's an issue for another day, and I will actually be having another video on that because I find it quite interesting and important. The distinction here, however, is that she is not doing this through divine right. We fought a war over that, the English Civil War. In fact, we had two of them. In spite of this, and the lack of codified separation of church and state, particularly in the House of Lords, in which 26 bishops have constant seats, forming the Lords Spiritual, we arguably have a freer and more democratic system of governance than that of the United States, whose founding fathers laid down in their constitution: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, yet suffer from a failure to separate religion from politics. I wonder what else you have to say.
One of the most prominent cultural revival movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the Irish Cultural Revival Movement, which arose out of a fear of Irish culture being anglicised, and which was a precursor to the nationalist Irish Revolution. Promoted in the early days at least by poets and playwrights such as William Butler Yeats and Lady Augusta Gregory in the Abbey Theatre, through works such as Caithfilín ní Shúilleabháin, The Irish cultural revival movement, unlike the ones in Germany, Italy, Hungary, and elsewhere, was the only one of its kind that didn't result in the rise of a fascist regime. It created a resurgence of a sense of Irishness, revived the Gaelic language, and created works of culture revered to this day. But the traditionalist, back to the roots nature of this movement didn't provide for a social framework that would combat injustice or guarantee individual liberties within that cultural framework. The widespread sexual abuse of children by the Catholic Church, the non-existent separation of church and state, the abuse of power by figures of authority, all went unpunished due to them being embedded within the revitalized cultural movement. Culture is no substitute for liberty.
Oh, for God's sake, man. I cannot believe what I'm listening to. Oh, that's it. Oh, fuck it. I'm getting a drink.
A few moments later.
Better?
Better. Right. This is where I think Kraut kind of takes a dive off the deep end. Your approach to the Irish cultural revival not only communicates a lack of understanding on Irish nationalist history, as far as Anglo-Irish relations, the Fenians and the Anglo-Irish War are concerned, but also a misinterpretation of the role of culture in unifying a society. Of course, I acknowledge that the Irish nationalism that we found in the later 20th century is quite intrinsically linked with the cultural revival. However, it is a subject which requires great length to explain, so perhaps I'll touch on it again at a later stage. For now, my advice would be to get your hands on a copy of the Oxford History of Ireland by R.F. Foster or Robert Key's Islander History, preferably both, as Key is an Irish nationalist and will be able to provide that perspective. Hopefully, that will fill you in on the fuzz, as I was really surprised at the misrepresentation here of Irish nationalism and its link to culture. Culture does not and is not designed to impose a framework on its people for how to live their lives. It is in its simplest form an expression of that way of life through artistic and social endeavour. The role culture plays in uniting a people can be summed up quite simply as providing a legacy of knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society which will constantly grow with the contributions of each generation. It is not a dogmatic system of belief, but an expression of them, a way for people to express what is important to them. It is in this way that culture can be seen as a more inclusive way of uniting a society than political or religious affiliations, as although culture provides a legacy, it doesn't enforce dogma. In its simplest form, it provides a library of experience and customs. It has no role in running a society, but that does not mean that you cannot construct one around it. Now, this may be where my personal biases kick in, as all the males in my direct bloodline through my father's side, bar myself, have served in Her Majesty's Armed Forces for the last 100 years. However, I do not think that denigrates the point I'm about to make. You say that the Irish cultural revival didn't result in a fascist regime. Well, in that regard, you were right, insofar as the Irish nationalists never constructed themselves as fascists, and it would be unjust to call those men who fought for their republic such, and lump them in with such a group of moral degenerates that plagued the continent. However, it should be noted that the nationalist revolt in Ireland was not based off a clash of culture, although it could certainly be said that culture was being used as a tool or banner to rally around. The terror campaigns which were fought by both sides of that long and bloody conflict throughout this period were sparked off by nearly 700 years of building tension between the colonised and the coloniser. Looking now at modern Northern Ireland, which is no longer a colony but instead an integrated part of the United Kingdom, for nearly 2 decades now, there's not been a major revolt or resurgence of violence on the scale seen in the Troubles. and this is because the people of Northern Ireland are beginning the long healing process of coming together as Irishmen, and have, through the sustained effort of authorities, the beginnings of a new identity. This shared cultural identity was seen by Peter Bull, a member of the British Psychological Society, in shifting patterns of social identity in Northern Ireland, as key to the peace process there. So I urge you to reconsider the power of culture in uniting a nation.
Switzerland is a nation of many faiths. Historically, the isolated lands within the Alps provided an ideal place for those fleeing persecution to go, from Calvinists to German Catholics to French Huguenots. Switzerland is also a nation of 4 languages: French, Italian, Retro-Romanic and German. And with that, it is also a nation of more than 4 cultures. These are all factors which would traditionally have fallen into the category of factors that would cause disunity rather than unity, at least according to the main driving political forces that have shaped Europe's nations over the course of the last 400 years. Yet despite that, the Swiss have been united not as the French, Germans or Italian population groups, or as varying religious groups, but as one nation under 4 languages, several cultures, several religious confessions, yet one nation, as one Swiss people, for over 500 years as the Swiss Confederation. Without any religious, nationalistic or any other tribal conflicts driving them apart or at each other's throats, the one thing which has united this nation and its people has been a common agreement and commitment on the preservation not of some concept of culture, faith or race, or language, but of democracy and the values of a free society.
I'm sure that certain individuals of Swiss descent would take issue with your assertion that Swiss culture plays no part in unifying Switzerland, but also that he has glossed over the role of continental politics in uniting the Swiss nation. Because yes, although the constitution certainly lays down the principles behind Swiss government, the historiography surrounding the Swiss cantons suggests that the external forces from nations such as revolutionary France, as well as the internal struggles between the various Reformed and Catholic parties in the old Confederacy, played a significant role in modern Swiss unity becoming necessary. Not because of any great moral purpose, but for survival against continental powers. This was not a movement centered on ideals such as the right of man.
Let me rephrase the question somewhat for you. If you are someone who argues for a cultural or ethnic or racially homogeneous society and uses one of these causes as your primary point of argumentation, what exactly is a purely Catholic, a purely German or a purely white society worth when you live in a miserable existence in chains under serfdom? Whatever cause you may have written upon your flag as the prime motivator for your political and cultural engagement, none of these causes are in any way a viable substitute for liberty and the rights of man.
Now this, Kraut, is where I think my biggest and yet most simple contention lies. You seem to be under the mistaken impression that it is impossible to hold your culture, language and religion in high esteem without seconding classical liberal principles such as freedom of expression. This, I think, comes from the idea that to not be directly for liberal values immediately pits you against them. However, this is not the case. In fact, it is in the very essence of skepticism and social conservatism. Not to be against social reform, but to interrogate it as thoroughly as possible, and find the healthy middle ground between immediate upheaval and steady reform. This attitude can be seen throughout history, but the example I have on hand is the Chartist movement and reformist politics in Britain during the late 19th century. The franchise was being argued to be extended, and much to the contrary of popular belief, it was not a Whig government which passed in 1867 the Reform Act into law, but the Conservative Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, a rather shrewd gentleman indeed, and this legislation set a trend for the steady political and social reform throughout Britain. Now, I hope I didn't make too much of a fool of myself and that you enjoyed the video. If you did, please subscribe. This is the first of a myriad of content I'll be putting up on various issues. You can also follow me on Twitter at HLCasanova, the blog that I write, The Ranting of an Englishman, which I use to post content of a little more depth, than can be provided in videos is also something I highly recommend, as you know, a little bit of shameless shilling here. There's an annotation at the end of the video, so be sure to check that out. In the end card, you might notice an annotation in the bottom left-hand corner that links you directly to The Private of the Buffs, a ballad on the story of John Moyse, a soldier from the Opium Wars between Britain and Imperial China. He's not particularly well known, but his story is an interesting one, and certainly worth telling, so if you're interested in military, colonial history, or indeed Chinese history, be sure to check that out. In closing, I'd like to leave you with some words to ponder from Martin Luther King Jr. We are not makers of history. We are made by history. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye. Fucking cuck.